So let's take a look then at the book of Zephaniah. So we are making our way through the minor prophets, and I'm sure all of us have noticed that very often when you look at the minor prophets, you have recurring themes. And that's again going to be the case when we look at Zephaniah. So that's a good thing, because we're going to be very familiar with these themes by the end. And it's a great privilege to be able to take a look at each of the books in the Bible during this lockdown. So we'll see themes we've come across before, but we'll also see perhaps development of those themes, as well as there's one image in Zephaniah, an image of God that is very unusual. So let's take a look then at the very first verse. And verse 1 of chapter 1 gives us a lot of detail about the person of Zephaniah in terms of his ancestry. We don't know much about him biographically, but he's very keen to place himself in a line. So the very first verse then of chapter 1. So we've got the word of the Lord which came to Zephaniah, the son of Cushi, the son of Gedaliah, the son of Amariah, the son of Hezekiah, in the days of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah. Now, two things to note there. He is a prophet in Judah, and he's also identifying himself as the son of Cushi. Now, there's debate around that. There are those who say that Cushi is a proper name, and then there are others who say that Cush is the land of Ethiopia. And that actually what Zephaniah is doing is he's identifying himself as a Jew from the region of Ethiopia. And if that's the case, then he may well have been black, and he may well have been part of the dispersions that would have occurred over the centuries. So you make your own mind up. Is he simply identifying his father by his proper name, or is he giving us an indication there of his origins from the land of Ethiopia? Ethiopia itself will be mentioned in the prophecy in chapter 2 and in chapter 3. In chapter 2, you get Ethiopia condemned for the sins of the nation. And then in chapter 3, you get Ethiopia being blessed and restored by God. But let's take a look then at the structure of the book. So the very first verse is our introduction. And then you get the second section of the book, which extends from verse 2 down to verse 13, and that's God's judgment on the nation of Judah. So a generation or two before Zephaniah's day, the nation of Israel were carried away by the Assyrians. Do you remember? They were taken into captivity, and that was the end of the nation of Israel. So Judah has continued for this couple of generations. And what Zephaniah will do is he'll bring his message to Judah, asking them to learn from what happened to Israel. That really, because of the judgment of God on Israel, they now ought to be obedient. And if they were obedient to God, they might be spared their own judgment, and God may be favorable to them. But in this second section of the book, the idea seems to be, on balance, that God is going to judge Judah, that Judah herself will experience what Israel experienced as a nation. And so Zephaniah not only will bring this message of judgment against Judah, but the debate then, the discussion is around whether he lives to see it. Is he a contemporary in that sense of Jeremiah? Will he witness the siege of Jerusalem and the coming of the Babylonians? But the second section, verse 2 down to verse 13, is this idea of judgment against Judah. Then you get your third section, which is verse 14 to 18 of the first chapter. And here is a recurring theme. So you'll know the theme. We saw it in Amos. It was developed in Isaiah. We've come across it in Obadiah. We've seen it in the book of Joel. And it's mentioned, I think, in the book of Nahum. And that is the idea of the day of the Lord. And Zephaniah has a great deal to say about the day of the Lord. And in many people's opinion, Zephaniah has the most to say about the day of the Lord, this great theme, the day of the Lord. So that's from verse 14 of chapter 1 down as far as verse 18. And as you look down those verses, you can see how often the day is repeated, that phrase, the day, the day. We mentioned yesterday morning, didn't we, about a phrase that can be sounding like a bell, sober-minded. Well, here now we have this constant repetition, this tolling of the idea of the day of the Lord. That's Zephaniah 1, verses 14 through to 18. Then you get your section 4 of the book of Zephaniah, chapter 2, verses 1 through to 15. So that's the entire second chapter. And this chapter, again, is a theme that we've met before. The same prophets, Isaiah, Nahum, and others. And that's the idea that God will judge the surrounding nations. God will bring his judgment upon the enemies of the people of God. So whether that's Assyria, the Philistines, whether it's the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Ethiopians, all those surrounding nations, they too will know the judgment of God upon them. So as you just cast your eyes down chapter 2, you've got Moab being mentioned, and you've got other nations. You can see a reference in verse 12 to the Ethiopians. The Assyrians again are mentioned in verse 13. So very familiar theme to us now, okay? God will bring his vengeance upon the surrounding nations. Then section 5 is in chapter 3, and section 5 is verses 1 through to 7. And that's the idea of judgment on Jerusalem. So you may have it in your heading. And this is a message specifically now to the city of Jerusalem. And this message is against the temple, it's against the priests, it's against the sacrificial system, all of that is located with Jerusalem. So that's section 5, verses 1 to 7. As you look at verses 8 then through to 13, this is section 6. And this is where you're going to find some hope. And the hope is that as a result of the judgment of God, the nations themselves will end up turning to God. And you've got this sense there of the nations. So verse 8, my determination is to gather the nations to my assembly of kingdoms, to pour on them my anger, my indignation, my wrath, my fire. That's where it starts. And then you're going to progress then through to the idea of restoration and conversion. And then the seventh section is from verse 14 down to verse 20. And this is known as the Song of Joy. So again, you've got the progression through the prophecy of Zephaniah from judgment to hope and joy and rejoicing. And for many people, this is the best part of the book of Zephaniah. So if you take a look at chapter 3, and you've got verse 14, sing, O daughter of Zion, shout, O Israel, be glad and rejoice with all your heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. And here is this familiar theme now of reversal. So the God who has been angry and who has judged and has shown his wrath and has perhaps delivered the nation will now turn the people's sins away from them and will bless them. Verse 15, the Lord has taken away your judgments. He has cast out your enemy. The King of Israel, the Lord, is in your midst, and you shall see disaster no more. So it points to a future moment where God will bring joy and peace to his people. in that day. So can you see how the notion of day has been transformed? Chapter 1, you've got the day of the Lord, the day of judgment, the day of wrath, and now it becomes a day in the future where God will bless his people. So verse 16 of chapter 3, in that day it shall be said to Jerusalem, do not fear, Zion, let not your hands be weak. So the day itself now has changed to a day of restoration. So those are the 7 sections then in this very small book. I want to look at some of the themes, and the first of those themes we've mentioned, and it's the idea of the day of the Lord. And what I want you to notice is the way that Zephaniah deals with this. How does he frame his prophecy around the day of the Lord? Well, the 2 very interesting verses in chapter 1 are verses 2 and 3. And when I read these 2 verses, notice 2 things that Zephaniah is doing in these 2 verses. So Zephaniah 1, verses 2 and 3. I will utterly consume everything from the face of the land, says the Lord. I will consume man and beast. I will consume the birds of the heavens, the fish of the sea, and the stumbling block along with the wicked. I will cut off man from the face of the land, says the Lord. Now, remember our skills, the key that we use, those 7 ways in which we seek to interpret our Bibles. Take a look at those 2 verses and see again which of those skills are being emphasized. So just like yesterday, if you take a look at verse 2, you've got the phrase, from the face of the land. You go into verse 3. At the end of verse 3, I will cut off man from the face of the land. Okay, so the face of the land is framing what Zephaniah is telling us. So you have verse 2, the face of the land, verse 3, the face of the land. So we've got that idea of bracketing, okay, by that phrase. Now, that phrase should be familiar to you. So think for a moment, where have you heard that phrase before? Cutting off from the face of the land. And that's a very unusual phrase, the face of the land. And you will have seen it in Genesis, and you will have seen it in the story of Noah. So what Zephaniah is doing is he's echoing the story of Noah and the flood as a metaphor for the wrath of God. Now, this isn't to say that Zephaniah is undoing God's promise. Remember, God promised that as long as the earth remains, seedtime and harvest, summer and heat, day and night will continue. Zephaniah is not undoing that. Zephaniah is simply using the idea of the flood as a way of visualizing the wrath of God that will come upon Judah. So reference to Noah is going on in these 2 verses, and that fits in with the idea of the day of the Lord. But then if there's bracketing going on with that phrase, remember you need to work out what's in between. Well, if you take a look at what's in between those 2 phrases. So Zephaniah 1 verse 2, from the face of the land, end of verse 3, from the face of the land, what's in between? And what the author wants you to do, Zephaniah, I guess, is to look at what's in between. So if you take a look at verse 3, I will consume man and beast, I will consume the birds of the heavens, the fish of the sea. Now, this is all very familiar again. Where have you come across man and animals and birds and fish? Where have you come across that? And so you're all going to say, I think I can see some of you even doing it, you're going to talk about the story of creation and the order of creation, how God creates in a certain order. Now, if that's the reference, what else do you notice then about this order? So in the order in creation, the end is the creation of man. Here, you start with man, and you then go from man to animals, and then from animals to birds, and then from birds to fish. So what Zephaniah is doing, he's reversing the creation order. And in reversing the creation order, what he is then doing, he's saying God in his judgment is going to undo creation. When he brings judgment, not just on Judah, I mean, that's the focus in this bit, but as you go into the rest of chapter 1 and you've got the day of the Lord, you have the sense that God will undo this particular creation. And that's a possibility, isn't it, for discussion, how we have the first creation in Genesis. Then Zephaniah tells us that there will be an undoing of this creation in the wrath of God. Then you go into the New Testament and you have the idea of the new heavens and the new earth, the new creation. And the theme of the new creation is huge in the New Testament. You see it in Peter, you see it in Paul. You've got Paul in many ways talking about a new creation. He says that we as Christians are new creation, so we are individual examples of the new creation that God will bring about. But then you've got the heavens and the earth. You've got this cosmic, this big scale new creation. So Zephaniah is a midpoint between the idea of the first creation and then the new creation. He then says that the first creation will be reversed. It'll be undone in the purposes of God. Now, John will also, the Apostle John, talk about a new creation, but he does it in a very unusual way. So if we think of John chapter 1 and the prologue, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. There is John echoing the opening of Genesis, in the beginning. And so for John, he is bringing in a new creation that starts with the coming of Christ. So the new heavens, the new earth, the new creation is found in the person of Christ, who became flesh and dwelt among us. So Peter and Paul will talk about the physical creation being swept away and the new heavens and the new earth. But John has a more theological, is that the right word, do you think? Understanding of the new creation. But what Zephaniah is doing then, he's saying that the old creation will be undone. So that's a theme, the day of the Lord. So it extends into verses 14 to 18. And just take a notice of verses 14, 15, and 16 now. In chapter 1 of Zephaniah. And I'm going to read them to give you a sense of what's happening. The great day of the Lord is near. It is near and hastens quickly. The noise of the day of the Lord is bitter. They, the mighty men, shall cry out. That day is a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, a day of devastation and darkness, a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness, a day of trumpet and alarm against the fortified cities, against the high towers. Now, you've got the word day repeated there with added and developed descriptors to each one. And what I want you to notice about this is it's referred to as the day of wrath. There is a reference to trumpets. So verse 16, a day of trumpet and alarm, a day of darkness and gloominess. And two things I want you to think about here. In the Latin version of the Old Testament, this is known as the Dies Irae, the day of wrath. And this passage, 14 to 16, has become part of the Roman Catholic tradition around the Requiem Mass. So some of you will know the idea of a Requiem from classical music. So you'll have Mozart's Requiem, you've got Verdi's Requiem. The day of wrath that you come across in those Requiems is lifted from this section in Zephaniah. So you've got the Day of Wrath. It's in the formal services that you find in the Roman Catholic Church. And then you've got the bringing in of a trumpet. And you can see it there, can't you, in verse 16. A day of trumpet and alarm. Now that is taken forward by the Apostle Paul, as you would easily work out. A trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised, and we shall all be changed. Okay, so Paul picks up on Zephaniah. He then also goes back to Moses, when Moses was on Mount Sinai, and God came in thick darkness and cloud upon Mount Sinai, and there was thunder and lightning, and the trumpet sound, and God gave the 10 Commandments. Paul brings together Moses and the darkness, Zephaniah and his darkness, and Paul then develops that into the Christian doctrine of the day of judgment and the sounding of the trumpet and the raising of the dead. That's what we notice there. All right, so a couple of other things to notice. And if you go into chapter 3 and verses 12 and 13, you have a development there of an idea that was very prominent in the ministry of Isaiah. And for some people, this means that Zephaniah may have been a disciple of Isaiah. Now, whether there's enough evidence to actually come to that conclusion or not, some people would suggest it. So if you take a look at chapter 3 and verses 12 and 13, I will leave in your midst a meek and humble people, and they shall trust in the name of the Lord. And here's the idea, the remnant of Israel shall do no unrighteousness and speak no lies, nor shall a deceitful tongue be found in their mouth. Well, you're getting the doctrine of the remnant. And the idea here is that when God judges, there will be a handful left behind. So there will be a handful living in Judah, there will be a handful living in Israel, and from that remnant, that stump, and that's the basic idea of the word, that you cut down a tree and you get a stump left in the ground, from that, then the purposes of God will flourish again. So Isaiah has a great deal to say, using the imagery of a chopped tree to talk about the remnant, and here is Zephaniah doing the same. From a Christian point of view, I think there's a lot of confusion about the idea of a remnant. Some people will use it to say, oh, look, we're getting fewer and fewer, we're getting older and older, we're getting weaker and weaker, oh, that's the remnant. Well, that's not the case at all. The remnant theology does not mean that there'll be a handful of Christians left, kind of thing, you know, that we'll kind of just be down to a few in number. Remnant is an illustration of the purposes of grace. So elect according to the purposes of grace. The remnant metaphor is another way of talking about God's election and how he elects from amongst a number a people for himself. So that's the remnant then. And what have we got left? Two things, I think. If you look at chapter 3 and verse 20, this verse has been politicized, and it's used, and we've got to be careful what we say, but it's used to justify the creation of the nation of Israel in 1947 and the ongoing support that the nation of Israel seeks from Christian nations, primarily the United States. So Zephaniah 3 verse 20, at that time, I will bring you back, even at the time I gather you, and I will give you your fame and praise among all the peoples of the earth, when I return your captives before your eyes, says the Lord. Now look at the first phrase, at that time I will bring you back. So this verse forms part of the theological justification for the state of Israel. God is bringing the captives from the nations of the world back to the land itself. And so this is a very tricky way in which this verse is used as part of the dialogue around the existence of the state of Israel. And then the very last thing to do is to take a look at verse 17. And verse 17 has a beautiful image of God and his care for his people. And it's one of those verses like the one you find in Deuteronomy, you know, underneath of the everlasting arms. It's a verse that is so poetic and so beautiful that it's often taken by itself as a way of comforting and strengthening ourselves in our understanding of God. So Zephaniah 3 verse 17, the Lord your God in your midst, the mighty one will save you. He will rejoice over you with gladness. He will quiet you with his love, and he will rejoice over you with singing. If I was to say to you, what's that an image of? What's the idea there? Okay, quietening somebody with their love, rejoicing over them with singing. And it's not difficult to work out that what we have here is the image of a mother. So if you think of what we've been told in verse 17, he will rejoice over you with gladness. That's the idea of a mother. It's rejoicing, coochie-cooing, if that's a word, her child. Then you've got, he will quiet you with his love. So there's a distressed baby, a distressed child, and the mother is soothing and quietening the child because she loves the child. And then you have, he will rejoice over you with singing. And it's the way that you would sing a child to sleep, that you may even, you know, play singing games with a child. Now, it's the image of a mother, but we have the male pronoun, he will. But nonetheless, even though we've got he, the imagery there is female. And it's a very unusual occasion, very rare example of God describing himself in female terminology, female imagery. And again, you could imagine, can't you, that this would be used by those who wish to address God as female, who think we should think about God as female, or that we shouldn't think about God as male or female. Now we know, don't we, that male and female is reference to the body, to the sexed body, and God is spirit. God has no physical substance. So it raises the question of how we are meant to think of God from the point of view of a gender. And Jesus will say, your heavenly Father. So he's very clear that the gender of God is male. But here is just to notice a verse that, whilst you and I may think it's a very wonderful image of the nurturing, caring, soothing, loving way that God cares for his people, there are those who would use it to have this discussion about should we think of God as male or female. I mean, there are other places in our Bible where God compares himself to a tree. And, you know, do you remember that occasion where he is a green bay tree and he offers shelter to his people, and his people then can come and eat of his fruit? Well, again, you wouldn't then say, well, that allows us to think of God like that, does it? These are images. But what I'm asking you is just to be aware of how these images can be used in our current culture. So there's the prophet Zephaniah then. Now, there are other Zephaniahs in our Bible, not to be confused with this one. So you'll find a Zephaniah in the book of Jeremiah, you'll find a Zephaniah in Chronicles, and you'll find a Zephaniah in Zechariah. But these are not our guy. Our guy in verse 1 of chapter 1 has very clearly identified himself in this sort of patrilineage way. So that, everyone, is the book of Zephaniah.